I'm with Elana Heideman from Israel Forever Foundation, and we're talking about Passover. And I imagine that there is joy and sadness this Passover. More hostages have been released, but there's still hostages in the tunnels.
There is joy, there is sadness, there is confusion, there is frustration, and there is truly a feeling of helplessness. And yet, side by side, we have to keep our hope up and we have to keep our strength and we have to stay courageous and we have to fight compassion fatigue. So it very much is a heavy, heavy time and a challenging Passover this year for sure.
And Moses cried, "Let my people go." Is that the cry today in Israel?
It is indeed, has been now for 18 months, something that
Mm.
we have had to beg the world. Now, people think of let my people go when Moses stood in front of Pharaoh and begged for the release of the Israelites who were kept as slaves and being persecuted again and again in every way. Now, when we are crying, let our people go, it's this collective, not just one individual, but as many individuals as can be involved. Those are the voices that we need in order to make our message heard. And yet we see after 18 months that we still are being ignored, disrespected, disregarded. The stories of hostages don't matter to so many people. The fact that there are still hostages doesn't matter to more of the world than we wish. And that's really the truth. It is our rallying cry. It's changed, I think, a little even since the early months of the war. It was bring them home. Right? It was echoing previous sentences about kidnapped groups, whether it was the boys that were kidnapped in 2014 here in Israel, or even the girls from Boko Haram who had been kidnapped, and the thousands of the Yazidi who had been taken captive. So we say bring them home. But the responsibility then was put solely on the sovereign entity of an Israeli government, which we hope, we wish would have the power to be able to sway the world and demand of the terrorist organization Hamas and all of the entities of Islamic Jihad to demand of them to bring our people home. Now we are demanding again and again the same phrase, but more. Let our people go because you're holding them hostage, you're holding them captive in conditions that now have been exposed to us through the many testimonies that have been shared. We know how horrifically they are being treated. We understand the brutality of what their conditions are, how they're being starved. And so when we say let our people go, it is an increased demand on the world. Unfortunately, though, we see that it is continuously met with silence, apathy, indifference, or worse, victim blaming. That somehow Israel is responsible for October 7th, even with the failings that took place, and certainly we know they did. But even with that, the blaming of Israel and Israelis as the cause of our own victimhood is a very dangerous part of how we use these phrases. Let our people go, bring them home now. We have to make sure that the integrity of the message is we were violated in the most horrific ways possible on October 7th. And 18 months later, the world has forgotten because they've become so enamored with the radical empathy for the sake of the Gazans, even though that entire population has not only shown themselves to be supportive of terrorism, but they also have been unwilling to assist in the human act of saving the hostages. They were offered $5 million for any single Gazan who would help bring home the hostages, and no one aided them. Even in the hostages meetings with President Trump, he personally was shocked to learn that no one offered them assistance, not even a slice of bread. And I think to myself, why be shocked anymore? We have watched them parade our hostages at the moments of their release in the most disgusting displays of vile anti Semitic propaganda. Why are we surprised? They are shouting, Khaybar, Khaybar al Yahud, kill the Jews again and again. They are rallying themselves not only in Gaza, but Judea and Samaria and every possible place in the world, where for 20 years they have infiltrated with terror funding and the mask of social justice. So while we say, let our people go, isn't it repulsive how they have twisted it around? Who is the victim? Those who actually infiltrated Israel's borders, committed the rapes, committed the murders, and somehow they become the eternal victim of the horrible Israel. So that narrative has been turned on its head. Just to connect it with Passover, it's crucial for us to understand that we, as the Jewish people, we as Israel, we know we've been living this generation after generation. And we will keep that rallying cry. And we have to also keep the unity behind that rallying cry and not let our politics divide us, because Hamas and the jihadists are trying to do just that. Even the left progressives are trying to do just that. Divide the Jews and you will be able to conquer us. But Passover is a major lesson for everyone to learn from. We will not be defeated and we will suffer great losses, but the hand of God will show itself, and the hands of the people and the voices of the people must also be heard again and again. Let our people go. So, yes, this year we will continue crying it out as we have for these 18 months since that horrendous day.
Mm. Now, some hostages have been released, and Israel has paid a heavy price to release some of these hostages. What are some of the stories that they're talking about that they went through?
It's hard to know where to begin because to dive into survivors' stories is something that is delicate. There are hostages who were released after 54 days of captivity, and there are hostages released after 500. What we learn by listening to each of their stories is how drastic things became very quickly. Those who were released in the earlier phases of releases in the first round, after only not even 2 months of war, already spoke about the brutality of their Hamas captors. They also spoke about the involvement of civilians. They spoke about the endless fears that they had to face. And those who have been released now have exposed even further detail of rapes that were taking place in front of them. So, forced tortures and sexual violence in front of other hostages. And so even though many of the narrators around the world claim that there is no evidence of rape, we not only have the GoPro videos taken on October 7th, but we now have eyewitness testimonies. Of course, for a survivor to speak of those types of horrific violations, it demands a lot of the individual. It returns them to their moments of trauma. So we find it a little bit surprising, many of us who've been myself involved in atrocity memory for many decades. It's almost surprising, and thankfully so, that these survivors are able to come out and give very specific testimonies so early on after their release. Elisha Rabi, who came home having lost over 40% of his body weight, and whose wife and daughters were murdered, and whose brother remains in captivity. His remains remain in captivity because he was murdered in captivity. And he has now traveled everywhere and anywhere that will listen to hear the stories of the forced starvation, the psychological abuses that were used in order to control them, even talking about the return to the family, even though they knew their captors that his family had been murdered. That style of false hope is a technique that is used by captors in many historical situations. But the way that the psychological torture was carried onward every day for all of these 500 plus days of captivity is an example of how the Hamas ideology, the ideology of all of the jihadists who are out to eliminate Jews and to bring a genocide against the Jewish people, it is based on the lack of recognition of the Jew as a human being. And I think that it's crucial to understand that all of the testimonies being shared give us an example of how these individuals were treated as if they were animals. the young women who have come out of captivity. Liri Albag, at one point, we saw an image of her wearing a dog collar. She had been kept on a chain while she was forced to serve the family. She was their slave in their home, forced to cook for them, but unable to eat. The same testimony of being forced to cook and feed the terrorists, but being deprived of food, is a very common, repeated element from the survivor testimonies. And sadly, also becoming a tool for those who continue to cast doubt on the integrity of Israel and the hostages, such as Leslie Stahl, who was the interviewer for the 60 Minutes interview of the hostages that took place. And she pushes back against that. And she says, how do you know that they didn't just have enough food? Falling into that trap of the Hamas rhetoric that there is a starvation campaign being brought by Israel against the Gazans, and it is completely untrue. In no other instance in history has a body that has been attacked been forced to provide for those who are the ones bringing about the terror. And yet, in this situation, that's exactly what Israel is expected to do, provide the food for the Gazan population. The claim of starvation amongst the Gazan population is an outright lie, other than the Gazans being deprived by Hamas, who steals all of the food for themselves and to use it as a technique to recruit additional soldiers. Of course, their soldiers are terrorists, meaning they're recruiting people by saying, we will give you food. You have to come and work for us to kill the Israelis, to destroy Israel, to bring about the genocide. And of course, to sacrifice your life, because that is the ultimate fulfillment of the Muslim ideology, to sacrifice yourself as a martyr. So we see how the hostages' testimonies are being manipulated even by those who claim to want to hear them. And it's important that people find a way and find the platforms through which you can hear more of these testimonies. There are pages on Facebook and Instagram, of course, and websites, Survived to Tell, people who are really determined to share their stories. And, Tal Shoham talks about how there was kind of a collective punishment. So they were, of course, kept in chains. The chains were often not long enough for space between the individuals, and they would be chained so tightly that it would cut into their skin. They would be forced to relieve themselves on themselves, no hygiene provided whatsoever. There is Omer Venkert shares his experience of being forced to bark for a full day, bark like a dog, on all fours, naked, bark like a dog. The brutality of the treatment of the hostages for many normal people, it just defies our imagination. We don't believe that such things could happen, that others could treat a fellow human being this way. And that's why it is crucial to hear their stories. Amit Susana, who was kidnapped and fought her way through the kidnapping. It took 7 men to finally grab her, where they kidnapped her and they put her into a room where she was held, tied up like a chicken from the rafters in the ceiling and beaten with sticks. She speaks very openly about her sexual abuse. And even one of the young teenagers has come forward about her sexual abuse at gunpoint to her head the entire time. We know the story of Elana, whose boyfriend Matan Zankauger remains in captivity, and Elana has come forward about her sexual abuse, that she passed out. And when she awakened, there were 7 terrorists standing above her, and she was without pants. And these details continue to be denied. The denial of October 7th is as real as the denial of the anti-Semitism that is an undercurrent that allows not only an October 7th to take place, but the continuation of an ideology that October 7th is an acceptable form of behavior because Israel has been demonized and Israelis demonized and Jews everywhere to such a degree. Additional stories that have been told, of course, Give us glimmers of hope. Those small miracles that took place within captivity. The young girls who taught themselves to sing the prayer, one of the prayers for Shabbat, and they taught it to themselves in Arabic, so that if they had spoken Hebrew, they would have been beaten. And as many of the survivors, the hostages, have testified, they were beaten daily and starved daily and forced to compete with each other for a morsel of food and put in situations where they had to find ways to sustain each other's strength. And those methods of helping one another were so instrumental, they say, to their psychological survival. The singing of the prayers, as I mentioned, and Omer Shem Tov speaks of how he had been given by chance a small bottle of grape juice that we get very often for the Shabbat table. And he made it last every Shabbat, making the prayer over the wine for the Kiddush, it's called. And he would take a little drop to just make this prayer. And there are stories of how they would support each other, the kinds of words they would give each other. They spoke even of those hostages who were murdered by Hamas and the wisdoms that they shared, like Hersh Goldberg, who went on to share the wisdom of Viktor Frankl, a survivor of Auschwitz, whose famous statement was for him a source of strength, and he passed it on to others in captivity that became their source of strength. So there are so many stories, and I wish I could tell them all. Imagining Yarden Bibas and what he has exposed in terms of his tortures. Let's also know that there are many of the tortures we might never hear. And our job is to protect the integrity of their experience and to make sure that the world does not stay silent, because our cry for let our people go has to include all people. Jews are human like everyone else. And when the world sees the Jew as a human being, then they negate the types of behaviors that the Hamas and other terrorists are bringing about in these stories of captivity. We need the world to stand behind the Jews as a people, as human beings who deserve everyone to stand up and scream out. We've heard the hostages' voices. We need to save those who can be saved. Alon Ohel, we know he is in a dire situation with his health. We have just received the first signs of life from a few other hostages, and we know that there are 24 hostages who are being identified by number. That evokes that association with the Nazi methods that were used, taking away their identity and calling them by a number instead of a name. The hostage experience is happening as we speak. And it's in direct juxtaposition with how we're living free lives. So we need to appreciate as we approach Passover that this holiday of freedom will never truly be free until our hostages are released, because we are all still captive. And in this generation, the entirety of the world of humanity must stand up and call for the release of the hostages.
Have all the hostages been kept underground? And when they were there, did they know their time and the day? Did they know actually how long they'd been in captivity?
They found very unique methods of counting not the days, but they've spoken very openly about how they counted more the minutes, and the way that the hours passed they could not know, because the majority of the hostages were kept entirely underground. We know that several who've recently found, been released to freedom were kept underground literally until 1 week before they were released, and only at that point were they force fed excess food in order to make them look heavier, because they had lost so much weight. But we also know from Elia Cohen, for example, that the terrorists came in and they would strip them naked and say, this one's not thin enough. Deprive him of more food. We know that, yes, they were kept underground, No, they did not see the light of day. No, they did not always have an accurate sense of time. They did try to keep a sense of the week in terms of when was Shabbat. We know that they were able also to use the Jewish holidays as a way, because the terrorists would make a mention of these things again as a type of psychological terror. Your family is celebrating and you are here. They don't care about you. They've moved on without you. No one is fighting for your existence. They don't care that you're here. There were even hostages who reported that the terrorists were telling them that Israel had been destroyed. They did not know. They did not actually know what happened, some of them who had been held underground without access to radio or news. We do know, of course, that there were hostages who were kept as slaves in citizen homes, some of those citizens being so called professors and doctors, United Nations workers, Red Cross, it is believed, was also compliant in the captivity of hostages. We know these things now, and yet still not being held accountable. They were able to, on occasion, maybe catch something on the radio or in the news. And they said that every time they heard of all of the efforts being made to bring attention to the plight of the hostages and all of the cries of the families and people around the world and the world leaders, that was what gave them hope that they could outlast. And what's that famous quote by Viktor Frankl that Hersch Goldberg passed on to others and they passed on to us? He who has a why to live for can outlast any how. Their why is that they have to keep going. And they even, by the way, the hostages shared that there were some instances where they had to convince a fellow hostage not to try and take their own life because the suffering was so severe. So they really, that community support, that of one another. There was two hostages that only met briefly while passing each other in the tunnels. And when they were reunited, it was as if brothers coming together. So I think that there are so many elements, this kaleidoscope of the experience, and how we're not only living it through what they've survived, but also what we need to carry on. I think there's a lot of room for a common person to decide to learn more and to do more with what they learn. That's the only way that we're going to not only make sure that our hostages are all released to freedom, but that the experience is carried on and we are learning lessons from it for the sake of the future.
It's been 550 days since October the 7th. What is your prayer for the hostages still being held?
Endless strength. Eli Sharabi spoke about in his first interview, which was just within 1 week of his release. He said that from the first moment he was kidnapped, he said something he had never said before, which is one of the fundamental prayers in Judaism, Shema Yisrael, that Hero Israel, Lord our God is one. It is an affirmation of our faith. And he said that every day while he was in captivity, he said Shema. And he said, there's something under there that is protecting us. So I pray that more people will pray and give them strength by virtue of our prayers. And more people will take upon themselves to do something every day, because that is our obligation to the humanity we've been gifted by the hand of God. And we have to live that humanity. My prayer for the hostages also extends to their families. We do not often talk about what the hostages who have been released must be enduring, but the trauma does not end. There are hostages who are released, like Arbel Yehud, who you do not hear from. She was kept alone the entire 400 plus days that she was in captivity. The tortures we have to imagine, because we have not heard testimony. We have heard snippets, and we can only imagine just how horrific her experience was. She had no idea. You asked about the passing of time. She had no idea how long that she had been under there. But even Emily Hand, who was 9 years old when she was kidnapped and she was released after 54 days, she thought she had been underground a whole year after only 50 days. So those who are underground right now have no idea of the passing of time. What is my prayer? That they will stay strong, that the families will not turn to the tendency to politicize and blame ourselves for this victimization, that the voices of the various efforts fighting for the rights of the hostages will be unified instead of pulling everyone to one extreme or the other. And it's at this point we also have to evoke a recognition that there was a ceasefire that enabled the release of the hostages. That ceasefire allowed people to become a little bit comfortable with so called peace, but that was not peace. During that time, Hamas continued to dig, as Tal Shoham and a few other of the released survivors, they said they dug every day more tunnels. They worked on more missile building. And we've seen that more missiles are now being fired since the ceasefire. More terror attacks continue to be attempted. And so the war had to return in order to put pressure on the terrorist regimes and say, your terror will not win. I pray that the hostages remain strong and resolute and know that the only reason we must go back to this war is because we must uproot all concept of terrorism as a legitimate act, as a legitimate form of what the world calls as resistance. No, it must be identified as the terrorist tyranny that it is, the horrific attempt to bring the genocide against Israel and the Jewish people all over the world. Anti Semitism has risen over 400% everywhere in the world. And the only way we're going to counter it is by continuing to show Israel's strength. And I don't mean only the state of Israel, but the nation of Israel, the same nation of Israel that felt strong to believe the word of God, to believe Moses, to put the blood on the doorposts as the angel of death came through the Egyptian communities of the enemies who wanted to wipe out the Jews. And instead, it brought retribution for those who had enslaved the Jews who were strong enough to follow Moses into the crossing of the Red Sea and into the desert and to that freedom where how could we know? How could we know that the freedom Moses was going to promise was going to be a good freedom? There were even people who doubted and who said, we're going to turn back. It's easier to stay slaves than it is to take on the challenge of being free. Isn't that a fascinating metaphor for today? It's easier to say, yes, we will release however many convicted murderers as necessary in order to release our hostages and give you whatever ceasefire just so we can have peace. But at what price? Premature peace with a terror entity will only bring more terror and more murder in the future. So, going back to the question of what is my prayer? Well, Dayenu, as we say at the Passover Seder. If you had only done this, it would have been enough. But no, not Dayenu yet. We have to not say it is not enough until we have conquered the idea of Hamas as legitimate. We have conquered the taking of our innocence and the raping of our women. And by the way, evidence has also now come to light of the raping of men, children, and elderly on October 7th. Our prayer must be that their memory continues to serve and be justice towards whatever battles we must fight, because the war for the Jewish freedom did not end when we crossed the Red Sea. It did not end even in the War of Independence. It doesn't end now until Jews are free everywhere and forever.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more about the work that you do?
Come and listen, come and learn, at israelforever.org. Follow us on Instagram, where we share daily inspirations and informational resources that you can use. Be a part of Declaration Day and mark May 14th as the official day of Israel's independence. There are so many ways that we provide for you to do more in your life, in your community, in your family, and in your heart. Come and look at Israel Forever and be a virtual citizen of Israel for us today and always. That is what will bring peace for all humanity.
Well, Elana, thank you very much for sharing today.
Thank you so much for having me, and may everybody feel empowered to be a part of this historic time.